from stone to light. Marcus Stone had built walls around his heart, brick by painful brick, each one cemented with the bitter mortar of betrayal. The sprawling Texas ranch that stretched before him, with its endless horizons and whispering grasslands, had become both his sanctuary and his prison. He was a man carved from the very landscape he tended, weathered and unyielding, his soul as parched as the summer earth beneath his boots. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty plains, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the darkness within him. Every morning, Marcus rose before dawn, the silence of his empty house a constant reminder of what he'd lost, or rather, what had been stolen from him. His days were filled with the rhythmic routine of ranch work, tending to cattle, mending fences, and losing himself in the physical labor that kept his mind from wandering to places too painful to revisit. Have you ever felt the weight of loneliness so heavy it becomes a physical presence? Marcus knew that feeling intimately. The betrayal had come from Eliza Hayden, the woman he'd planned to marry, the woman who had promised him forever and delivered only devastation. She had left him standing at the altar of his own expectations, choosing instead a life with someone who could offer her the glittering promises of city lights and endless possibilities. Marcus had offered her his heart, his land, his future, but it hadn't been enough. The memory of her departure was seared into his consciousness like a brand, marking him as permanently as the cattle he tagged each season. He remembered the exact moment she told him, the way her eyes couldn't meet his, the tremor in her voice that spoke of guilt but not regret. She had apologized, but apologies couldn't rebuild what had been shattered. The pain had been so acute in those first weeks that Marcus thought he might actually die from it. He would wake in the middle of the night, reaching for someone who wasn't there, his hand grasping empty air and cold sheets. The phantom ache of her absence was worse than any physical injury he'd ever sustained. He'd broken bones, been kicked by horses, suffered through scorching summers and brutal winters, but nothing compared to the agony of a broken heart. Do you know what it feels like when the person you trusted most becomes a stranger? That disorientation, that fundamental betrayal of reality itself, had nearly destroyed him. In the aftermath, Marcus had retreated into himself, constructing an emotional fortress that no one could penetrate. His friends tried to reach him, to pull him back into the world of the living, but he resisted their efforts with the same stubborn determination he applied to everything in his life. His best friend, Jake Morrison, had shown up at the ranch countless times, bringing beer and conversation, trying to coax Marcus back to life. But Marcus had perfected the art of being present while remaining completely absent, going through the motions of friendship without actually engaging. He convinced himself that solitude was safer, that independence was strength, that needing no one meant never being hurt again. The ranch became his entire universe. A self-contained world where he controlled every variable, where nothing unexpected could wound him. He stopped going to town except when absolutely necessary. He avoided social gatherings, church services, community events. He became a ghost in his own life, visible but not really there. But isolation, he was learning, came with its own particular brand of suffering. The silence that had once felt protective now felt suffocating. The empty spaces in his home echoed with absence. The bed seemed too large, the dinner table too quiet, the future too bleak and unchanging. He watched the seasons cycle through their eternal dance, spring giving way to summer, summer fading into fall, and he felt himself aging, not just in years but in spirit, growing harder and colder with each passing month. His reflection in the mirror showed a man who looked older than his 38 years, lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth, a permanent furrow between his brows. What happens when a heart stops believing in second chances? Marcus was living proof of that slow death, a walking testament to the corrosive power of unhealed wounds. He had become a cautionary tale, the man who let one betrayal define the rest of his life. People in town spoke about him in hushed tones, shaking their heads with pity. Poor Marcus Stone, they'd say, never recovered from what Eliza did to him. He heard the whispers, saw the sympathetic looks, and they only reinforced his determination to remain isolated. He didn't want their pity. He didn't want their concern. He wanted to be left alone with his pain, to nurse it like a familiar companion. Then autumn arrived, painting the landscape in shades of gold and amber, and with it came Sophia Bennett. She appeared at his ranch one crisp October morning, her car sputtering and dying at the end of his long driveway like a mechanical prayer answered. Marcus approached her vehicle with suspicion, his instinct to help warring with his desire to remain uninvolved. Sophia emerged from the car, her dark hair catching the morning light, her eyes bright with a mixture of frustration and hope. She was beautiful in an understated way, her features soft where his were hard, her demeanor open where his was closed. She wore jeans and a simple blue sweater, practical but somehow elegant. There was something about her that immediately set her apart from anyone he'd encountered in years. She explained her situation with an apologetic smile. Her car had broken down, her phone had no signal, and she was desperately trying to reach the neighboring town for a job interview. Marcus listened with his arms crossed, his expression neutral, every fiber of his being screaming at him to offer minimal assistance and send her on her way. But something in her eyes, a vulnerability mixed with determination, cracked something in his carefully constructed armor. He offered to call a tow truck and drive her to town, the words leaving his mouth before his brain could veto them. The drive into town was awkward, filled with Sophia's attempts at conversation and Marcus's monosyllabic responses. She asked about the ranch, about his life, about the landscape, and he answered with the bare minimum, determined not to engage, not to open even the smallest door. But Sophia was persistent in a gentle way, not pushy but genuinely curious, and despite himself, Marcus found his responses growing longer, his tones softening incrementally. She told him about herself, about her dreams of starting fresh in a small town, about leaving behind a life that had felt increasingly hollow and meaningless. She'd been working as a veterinarian in Dallas, she explained, but the city had worn her down. The constant noise, the traffic, the superficial relationships, all of it had left her feeling empty. She wanted something real, something meaningful, a place where she could make a genuine difference. There was something in her story that resonated with him, a kindred recognition of someone seeking refuge from their own past. Could it be that broken people recognize each other instinctively? Marcus wondered if his damage was as visible to her as hers was becoming to him. He dropped her off at her interview and drove away, convinced that would be the end of their brief intersection. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Sophia got the job, a position at the local veterinary clinic, and within weeks their paths began crossing with increasing frequency. She would stop by the ranch to check on his livestock, her professional expertise giving her a legitimate reason to visit, and each time Marcus found his resistance weakening. She had a way of seeing past his gruff exterior, of treating his silence not as rejection, but as a language she was learning to speak. She didn't push, didn't demand, didn't expect anything from him. And paradoxically, that made him want to give more. The first few visits were purely professional. She examined his cattle, checked for signs of disease, offered advice on nutrition and care. But gradually, the visits extended beyond the purely medical. She'd accept his offer of coffee, then stay to chat on the porch. She'd comment on the beauty of the sunset, and he'd find himself sitting beside her to watch it. She'd mention a book she was reading, and he'd discover he'd read it too, leading to conversations that stretched long into the evening. Have you ever felt yourself changing without consciously deciding to change? That's what was happening to Marcus, a gradual thawing he couldn't control, and increasingly didn't want to. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls began to crumble. Marcus found himself looking forward to her visits, preparing coffee before she arrived, lingering in conversation longer than necessary. He discovered that she was funny, that her laugh was infectious, that her presence brought a warmth to his home that had been absent for years. She had a quick wit and a gentle humor that could make him smile despite himself. She'd tease him about his grumpiness, but in a way that felt affectionate rather than critical. She'd challenge his pessimistic worldview, but without judgment, simply offering alternative perspectives. She learned about his past, not through interrogation, but through patient observation and the occasional carefully asked question. When he finally told her about Eliza, about the betrayal that had defined his last several years, Sophia listened without judgment, without offering platitudes or easy solutions. She simply acknowledged his pain, validated his feelings, and then gently suggested that perhaps he'd been punishing himself more than protecting himself. The observation struck him with the force of revelation. Had he been so focused on avoiding future pain that he'd sentenced himself to a present devoid of joy? The question haunted him, forcing him to examine the life he'd built, or rather, the life he'd been hiding from. He realized that in his determination to never be hurt again, he'd ensured that he'd never feel anything again. He'd traded the risk of pain for the certainty of emptiness. And suddenly that trade seemed like a terrible bargain. Winter arrived, bringing with it cold winds and the kind of clarity that comes from stripped-down landscapes. Marcus realized he was falling in love with Sophia, and the realization terrified him. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to rebuild his walls, to protect himself from the inevitable hurt. But another voice, quieter but growing stronger, whispered that perhaps love was worth the risk, that a life lived in fear was no life at all. He wrestled with these competing impulses, his behavior toward Sophia becoming erratic, warm one day and distant the next. One day he'd open up to her, sharing stories from his childhood, his dreams for the ranch, his fears and hopes. The next day he'd barely speak, retreating behind his walls, convinced he was making a terrible mistake. She bore his inconsistency with remarkable patience, never demanding explanations, never issuing ultimatums. Are you brave enough to risk your heart again after it's been shattered? That was the question Marcus faced every time he looked at Sophia. It was the question that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing through every possible scenario. What if she left like Eliza had? What if he opened his heart only to have it broken again? What if he wasn't enough for her? What if the ranch, the isolation, the simple life he offered couldn't compete with whatever else the world might offer her? The fears were relentless, a constant chorus of doubt. But there was another voice too, one that reminded him of how alive he felt when he was with her, how the world seemed brighter and more full of possibility. One evening, as they sat on his porch watching the sun set over the ranch, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Sophia turned to him and said simply, "I'm not her, Marcus. I'm not going to hurt you." The words were quiet but firm, a statement of fact rather than a promise. And in that moment, Marcus understood that she was right. Sophia was her own person, with her own integrity, her own capacity for loyalty and love. Judging her by Eliza's actions was not only unfair, it was a form of cowardice, a way of avoiding the vulnerability that real connection required. He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers, and felt something shift fundamentally within him. The walls didn't crumble all at once, but they began to dissolve, brick by brick, replaced not with emptiness, but with possibility. He told her he was scared, that he didn't know if he remembered how to love without fear, and she told him that was okay, that they could figure it out together. That night, for the first time in years, Marcus felt hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone trying to recapture what was lost, but the quiet, steady hope of someone discovering something new and unexpected. The months that followed were not without challenges. Marcus still had moments of doubt, times when old fears resurfaced and threatened to overwhelm him. There were days when he'd wake up in a panic, convinced that Sophia would realize she'd made a mistake, that she'd leave him just like Eliza had. There were moments when he'd test her, pushing her away to see if she'd stay, engaging in the self-sabotaging behavior of someone who'd been hurt too deeply. But Sophia remained constant, her presence a steady anchor in the storms of his uncertainty. She showed him through actions rather than words that love didn't have to be a source of pain, that trust could be rebuilt, that hearts were more resilient than he'd given them credit for. When he pushed her away, she gave him space but didn't disappear. When he lashed out in fear, she responded with compassion rather than anger. When he doubted her commitment, she showed up day after day, proving through her consistency that she meant what she said. Do you believe that people can truly change, or are we forever defined by our wounds? Marcus was discovering that change was possible, but it required courage and the right person to believe in you. They built a life together slowly, carefully, each day a small act of faith. Sophia moved into the ranch, bringing with her laughter and light, transforming the space from a lonely outpost into a home. She hung curtains in the windows, planted flowers in the garden, filled the bookshelves with novels and poetry. She cooked meals that filled the house with delicious aromas, played music that echoed through rooms that had been silent for too long. They worked side by side, tending to the land and the animals, building something together that was stronger than what either could have created alone. Marcus learned to open up, to share not just his present, but his past. To let Sophia see all of him, even the broken parts. And in her acceptance, he found healing. He told her about his childhood, about his parents who'd worked this land before him, about his dreams and disappointments. He shared his fears, his insecurities, the dark thoughts that sometimes plagued him. And she listened to all of it, holding space for his pain without trying to fix it, simply being present with him in his vulnerability. The ranch, once a symbol of his isolation, became a testament to his transformation. Where there had been only silence, now there was conversation and music. Where there had been emptiness, now there was companionship and love. Marcus still bore the scars of his past, but they no longer defined him. He had learned that being hurt didn't mean being destroyed, that betrayal by one person didn't negate the possibility of loyalty from another. He reconnected with friends he'd pushed away, attended community events with Sophia by his side, began to participate in life again rather than just observing it from a distance. Jake Morrison, his best friend, remarked one day that it was like getting the old Marcus back, but better, more grounded, more appreciative of what he had. Spring came again, as it always does, bringing renewal and growth. Marcus stood on his porch, Sophia beside him, and looked out over the land he loved. The landscape hadn't changed, but everything else had. He had been given a second chance, not because he deserved it or earned it, but simply because life, in its mysterious way, had offered it, and he had been brave enough, finally, to accept it. Have you ever experienced the moment when you realize you're no longer defined by your past? Marcus lived in that moment now, grateful for the journey that had brought him here, grateful for the woman who had seen past his walls to the man he could become. The ranch stretched before them, full of promise and possibility, and for the first time in years, Marcus looked toward the future, not with dread, but with hope. His story was not one of forgetting the past, but of refusing to let it dictate the future. It was a story of redemption, of second chances, of the transformative power of love when we're brave enough to accept it. And as he pulled Sophia close, feeling her warmth against him, Marcus understood that the greatest courage wasn't in building walls, but in having the strength to tear them down. He thought about proposing, about making their commitment official, and the thought didn't terrify him the way it once would have. Instead, it filled him with excitement, with anticipation for the future they would build together. Will you take the risk of opening your heart again? That's the question we all face, after betrayal, after loss, after the kind of pain that makes us want to retreat forever. Marcus's answer, hard-won and precious, was yes. And in that yes, he found not just love, but himself, the version of himself that had been buried beneath years of hurt and fear. The sun rose over the Texas plains, casting golden light across the ranch, and Marcus Stone, once broken, now healing, stood ready to embrace whatever came next, knowing that with Sophia by his side, he could face anything. This is the power of love, the miracle of second chances, the promise that no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes for those brave enough to wait for it. Are you ready to believe in your own second chance? Marcus had learned that healing wasn't a destination but a journey, one that required patience, courage, and the willingness to be vulnerable. He had learned that the walls we build to protect ourselves often become the prisons that confine us. He had learned that love, real love, doesn't demand perfection, but accepts us as we are, while inspiring us to become better. And most importantly, he had learned that it's never too late to choose hope over fear, connection over isolation, life over mere existence. The ranch that had once been his hiding place had become his home, not because the land had changed, but because he had. And as he stood there with Sophia watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, Marcus Stone knew with absolute certainty that he had finally found his way back to life.